I never believed in ghosts until I found myself trapped 70 feet underground with dozens of them, all waiting for a train that would never come. My name is David Rodriguez, and I've been a maintenance engineer for the Chicago Transit Authority for 15 years. I've seen everything you can imagine in these tunnels, from rats the size of cats to homeless encampments that stretch for miles. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I discovered in the abandoned Red Line extension tunnels beneath Lower Wacker Drive. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had your own supernatural encounter in underground spaces, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about the city beneath your feet forever. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. The air was crisp with that Chicago autumn bite, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee when my supervisor, Marcus, dropped a work order on my desk that would change my life forever. "Rodriguez, we need you to do a structural assessment on the old Red Line extension tunnels. Cities finally thinking about converting them into utility corridors." I looked up from my computer screen, confused. Which extension tunnels? The ones they started digging in 1987 but never finished. About 2 miles of tunnel work before the project got scrapped due to budget cuts. They've been sealed off for over 30 years. Marcus handed me a folder thick with blueprints and safety protocols. The tunnel system was more extensive than I'd imagined. A complex network of main passages, service tunnels, and emergency chambers that stretched from the Chicago River all the way to Grant Park. "Why hasn't anyone been down there since they sealed it?" "Oh, people have been down there," Marcus said, his expression growing serious. 3 different inspection teams over the years. First team in 1995 came back up after 2 hours, said the air quality was too poor to continue. Second team in 2003 lasted about 4 hours before they reported equipment malfunctions. Third team in 2018, he paused, shuffling through some papers. Third team, they requested immediate reassignment to different projects. All 3 guys wouldn't talk about what they saw down there, just said they needed off the job. I should have seen that as a red flag. Should have asked more questions. But I was focused on the overtime pay and the fact that this kind of assessment could take weeks to complete properly. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow. You'll have full access to the sealed entrance at Lower Wacker. Take all the safety equipment you need, radio, gas monitor, the works. And Rodriguez, yeah? Don't go down there alone. Take someone with you." But that's exactly what I ended up doing. The next morning, my assigned partner called in sick with what sounded like a legitimate case of food poisoning. I called Marcus to see if he could get me a replacement, but with budget cuts and staffing shortages, everyone was already assigned to priority projects. "Just do a preliminary assessment," Marcus told me over the phone. "Get a feel for the structural integrity, air quality, that sort of thing. If anything seems off, you come right back up." Hit the like button if you think I should have listened to that advice, because I was about to learn why 3 different teams had refused to go back down there. The sealed entrance was located in a maintenance facility beneath Lower Wacker Drive. It took me 20 minutes just to find the right door, a heavy steel barrier marked with faded warning signs about authorized personnel only. The lock was old but functional, and my master key turned with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty facility. Behind the door was a metal staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rushed up to meet me carried the scent of stagnant water, rusted metal, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. I switched on my headlamp and started my descent, my footsteps echoing with a hollow metallic ring. The staircase was longer than I'd expected, dropping down what felt like 7 or 8 stories before finally reaching a concrete platform. The tunnel stretched out before me like the throat of some massive beast, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of my light. The walls were concrete, stained with decades of water seepage and mineral deposits. Abandoned construction equipment sat rusting exactly where it had been left, in 1987. Wheelbarrows, scaffolding, and industrial lighting fixtures that hung like dead spiders from the ceiling. My first few steps into the tunnel were cautious, testing each section of floor before committing my full weight. The concrete seemed solid enough, though I could hear the drip of water somewhere in the distance. My radio crackled with static, but I could still reach the surface if needed. The further I walked, the more I realized just how extensive this abandoned system was. Every few hundred yards, I'd encounter junction points where smaller tunnels branched off from the main passage. Some of these were barely wide enough for a single person, while others opened into chambers that my flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. I'd been walking for about an hour when I noticed the first strange thing. There were personal belongings scattered throughout the tunnel, not homeless encampments, but individual items that seemed to have been dropped or abandoned. A leather briefcase, its contents spilled and water damaged beyond recognition. A woman's high-heeled shoe, sitting upright as if it had been carefully placed there. A child's backpack, faded and torn, with what looked like school supplies still inside. But the strangest part was how these items were distributed. They weren't clustered in areas where people might have taken shelter. Instead, they were spread out along the tunnel as if people had been walking through and simply dropped things. Comment below if you've ever found abandoned personal items in strange places, because I was about to discover that these belongings had a much more sinister explanation. As I continued deeper into the tunnel system, I began to notice that the air temperature was dropping. Not gradually, but in distinct pockets of cold that I'd walk through like invisible curtains. My breath began to fog, even though the outside temperature was mild for October. The sound of dripping water was getting louder, and I could hear something else now. A low, rhythmic sound that almost seemed like breathing. I stopped walking and listened carefully. But the moment I focused on it, the sound would disappear. It was around the 2-mile mark that I encountered my first structural anomaly. The tunnel ahead of me simply ended, not with a wall or barrier, but with what looked like solid rock. According to my blueprints, this section should have continued for another half-mile before reaching the first major junction. But here I was, standing in front of what appeared to be a natural cave formation. I approached the rock face carefully, running my hands along its surface. It was smooth, almost polished, and significantly warmer than the surrounding air. As I examined it more closely, I realized it wasn't rock at all. It was some kind of mineral deposit, like what you'd find in limestone caves. But we were in Chicago, built on relatively flat terrain. There shouldn't be any natural cave formations this deep. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time, the sound of a train approaching. The rumbling was unmistakable, that deep rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks that every city dweller knows instinctively. But according to my maps, there were no active train lines within miles of this location. The nearest functioning red line tracks were at least 20 blocks away. I stood perfectly still, listening as the sound grew louder. The rumbling seemed to be coming from deeper in the tunnel system, from one of the side passages I hadn't explored yet. As it reached its peak, I could even hear the screech of brakes and the hiss of pneumatic doors. Then, silence. Let me know in the comments if you've ever heard sounds that shouldn't exist in places where they can't be coming from. Because I was about to discover that what I'd heard was just the beginning. I backtracked to the nearest junction and chose the passage that seemed most likely to lead toward the source of the train sounds. This tunnel was different from the main passage, narrower, with tiled walls that reminded me of the old subway stations from the 1940s. The tiles were that institutional green color that was popular in public buildings decades ago, though many were cracked or missing entirely. As I walked through this passage, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. There were wet footprints on the floor. Not just a few prints, but dozens of them, leading in both directions along the tunnel. They were fresh, so fresh that water was still pooling in some of the deeper impressions. The prints were different sizes, suggesting multiple people, and they seemed to follow a purposeful pattern, as if people were walking with destination in mind. But I was supposed to be the first person down here in years. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely, and that's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The footprints weren't just on the floor. They were on the walls too. Perfectly clear impressions of shoes and bare feet walking up the vertical surfaces as if gravity meant nothing. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, and that's when I saw the first one. At the very edge of my flashlight beam, maybe 50 yards ahead, was a figure standing in the tunnel. It was the silhouette of a person, but something was wrong with the proportions. The figure was too tall, too thin, and it seemed to be swaying slightly, as if it was standing in a wind that I couldn't feel. I called out, "Hello, are you okay?" The figure turned toward me, and even from that distance I could see that where its face should have been, there was nothing but shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying encounters like this one, because I was about to discover that what I'd seen was just one member of a much larger community. I stood there for several minutes, sweeping my flashlight beam back and forth across the area where the figure had been. There was no sign that anyone had been there, no footprints, no disturbance of the dust and debris on the floor. But I knew what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain was trying to provide explanations. Poor lighting, fatigue, maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by the tunnel's acoustics. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that had kept humans alive for thousands of years, was screaming at me to run. I chose to keep going. The tunnel began to slope downward, and I could hear the sound of running water getting stronger. The air was getting thicker too, carrying scents that didn't belong in an abandoned subway tunnel. Coffee, cigarettes, and something that smelled like ozone after a thunderstorm. That's when I saw the lights. Up ahead, maybe a quarter mile, there was a faint glow coming from what looked like a chamber or platform area. It wasn't the harsh white light of modern fluorescence, but a warmer, yellower light that reminded me of the old incandescent bulbs they used to use in subway stations. As I got closer, I could make out the source of the light. It was coming from a platform area that had been constructed but never finished. The platform was partially completed, with sections of the classic subway tiles installed along the walls. But what caught my attention were the light fixtures. They were on, humming with electricity that shouldn't exist in an abandoned tunnel. And there were people on the platform. At first glance, it looked like a normal subway station scene. People standing around, some sitting on benches, others walking back and forth, as if waiting for something. There were men in business suits, women in dresses, children with school bags. The scene was so normal that for a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I noticed the details that made my blood run cold. Everyone was dressed in clothing from different decades. I saw a man in a 1940s suit standing next to a woman in a 1960s dress. A teenager in 1980s punk fashion was sitting next to an elderly man in what looked like clothes from the 1920s, and none of them were talking to each other. They were all just waiting. I watched from the shadows of the tunnel entrance, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These people weren't solid. I could see through them, like looking at someone through frosted glass. They moved, they shifted position, they even seemed to breathe, but there was something fundamentally wrong with their existence. That's when I noticed the train tracks. The platform had tracks, and they extended beyond the station area into tunnels that, according to my blueprints, didn't exist. The tracks were old, probably original to the 1940s, but they were clean and well-maintained. More importantly, they were humming with the vibration of an approaching train. Comment what you think was about to happen, because I was about to witness something that defied everything I thought I knew about life and death. The rumbling grew louder, and I could see a light approaching from the tunnel beyond the platform. It was an old subway train, the kind they used to run in Chicago back in the 1950s. Boxy, metal, with small windows, and that distinctive green and cream color scheme. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a hiss of steam. The doors opened and people began to board. But not the people I'd seen waiting on the platform. Different people, passengers who seemed to materialize from thin air as the train arrived. I watched in fascination and horror as the ghostly passengers filed onto the train. There were dozens of them, all from different time periods, all carrying the transparent quality of the people on the platform. They moved with purpose, finding seats, holding onto handrails, behaving exactly like living commuters. But that's when I saw something that made me realize the true horror of what I was witnessing. Some of the passengers boarding the train were carrying objects, briefcases, purses, children's toys, and I recognized these objects. They were the same items I'd seen scattered throughout the tunnel system on my way down here. The leather briefcase, the high-heeled shoe, the child's backpack. These weren't just abandoned belongings. They were the last possessions of people who had died in these tunnels, and their spirits were still carrying them, still trying to complete journeys that had ended in tragedy decades ago. The train sat in the station for exactly 3 minutes, then the doors closed with a mechanical clang that echoed through the chamber. As it pulled away, I could see the passengers through the windows, rows of transparent figures, all facing forward, all perfectly still. The train disappeared into the tunnel beyond the platform, and gradually the sound of its passage faded into silence. The people who had been waiting on the platform were still there, resuming their eternal vigil for the next train that would carry them to destinations they would never reach. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching this supernatural commuter scene play out. Every 20 minutes or so, another train would arrive, carrying a different group of passengers and taking on new ones. The schedule was precise, regular, as if death itself was running on a timetable. Share this video if you think others need to know what's really happening beneath our cities, because I was about to discover that this ghostly subway system extended far beyond what I could see. I decided to follow the platform around to its far end, where I could see another tunnel entrance. This passage was wider than the others, with multiple sets of tracks disappearing into the darkness. As I walked along the edge of the platform, I became aware that the ghostly passengers could see me. Their transparent eyes would follow my movement, and I could see their mouths moving as if they were trying to speak. But no sound reached me, just the movement of lips forming words I couldn't hear. Some of them pointed at me, and I got the distinct impression they were surprised to see a living person in their realm. The far tunnel led into what can only be described as a supernatural grand central station. The chamber was massive, with a vaulted ceiling that stretched up into darkness beyond my flashlight beam. Multiple platforms extended into the space, each one serving different tracks that led off in various directions, and there were hundreds of ghostly passengers. They filled the platforms, waiting in neat lines, sitting on benches, walking with purpose between different areas. The lighting here was brighter, coming from fixtures that cast that same warm yellow glow I'd seen at the first platform. The air hummed with the sound of multiple trains approaching and departing, a constant symphony of supernatural public transit. But it was the organization of it all that really struck me. This wasn't random supernatural activity. It was a system. These spirits weren't just wandering aimlessly through the tunnels. They were commuting, following routes, maintaining schedules, as if death was just another stop on their journey. I walked along the main platform, trying to understand what I was seeing. The ghostly passengers were segregated by time period, I realized. One section of the platform was filled with people in 1940s clothing, another with 1960s fashion, another with more modern dress. It was as if they were organized by the decade in which they had died. That's when I noticed the departure boards. High above each platform section were electronic displays showing destinations and times. But these weren't Chicago neighborhoods or suburbs. They were places I'd never heard of. Shadowmere Junction, Grief's End, the terminus of sorrows, Final Rest Station. Hit the like button if you're getting chills just thinking about this, because I was about to discover that these trains weren't just carrying passengers, they were carrying me. I was so focused on reading the departure boards that I didn't notice the train pulling into the platform behind me until I heard the familiar screech of brakes. This train was different from the others. Newer, cleaner, with the modern styling of current Chicago Transit Authority cars. The doors opened, and I felt a strange compulsion to turn around. When I did, I saw that all the ghostly passengers on the platform were looking at me expectantly. They weren't boarding this train. They were waiting for me to board it. A conductor stepped off the train, and unlike the passengers, he was completely solid, completely real. He was wearing a CTA uniform that looked brand new, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "End of the line, Mr. Rodriguez. This train is for the living." I backed away from the train, my heart pounding. "How do you know my name?" "We've been expecting you." "The others tried to warn you, but you kept going deeper. Now you're part of the system." I looked around the platform and realized that some of the ghostly passengers were looking at me with expressions I recognized, the same expressions I'd seen on the faces of my co-workers when they'd returned from their failed inspections of these tunnels. "The inspection teams," I said. "They're here." "Not here," the conductor said, "but they're in the system. Once you see us, really see us, you become part of the network. You can go back to the surface, but you'll always be connected to this place, and eventually you'll come back to stay." I ran. I turned and sprinted back the way I'd come, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran through the tunnels. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the train doors closing and the mechanical voice of the conductor calling out, "Next stop, surface level. Please stand clear of the closing doors." The ghostly passengers didn't follow me, but I could feel their eyes on my back as I ran. The tunnel seemed longer on the return journey, as if the space itself was stretching to delay my escape. The junction points that I'd passed on my way down appeared in different locations, and some of the passages I remembered weren't there anymore. But eventually, I found the main tunnel that led back to the staircase. I climbed those metal steps faster than I'd ever climbed anything in my life, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion and terror. When I finally emerged into the maintenance facility beneath Lower Wacker Drive, the normal world seemed almost unbearably bright and loud. I could hear traffic overhead, the hum of electrical systems, the distant sound of a helicopter. All the sounds of a living city that I'd taken for granted my entire life. I sealed the tunnel entrance behind me and sat in my truck for an hour, trying to process what I'd experienced. My radio was working fine, my equipment was functioning normally, and according to my watch, I'd been underground for exactly 8 hours, though it had felt like days. When I got back to the office, I told Marcus that the structural integrity of the tunnels was compromised and that the project should be abandoned. I submitted a report recommending that the tunnels be permanently sealed with concrete, citing safety concerns and structural instability. Marcus accepted my recommendation without question. He told me that the 3 previous inspection teams had submitted similar reports, and that the city was ready to write off the project as a loss. But here's the thing, I can't stop thinking about what I saw down there. And sometimes, late at night when I'm riding the Red Line home from work, I swear I can hear the sound of those ghostly trains running on tracks that don't exist, carrying passengers to destinations that aren't on any map. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something that changed your fundamental understanding of reality, because I know that what I saw in those tunnels was real. There's an entire supernatural transit system running beneath Chicago, operated by the dead for the dead, and it's been running for decades. The worst part is what the conductor told me, that I'm now part of the system. I can feel it sometimes, a pull toward the underground, a desire to return to those tunnels and take my place among the waiting passengers. It's getting stronger every day. I've started having dreams about boarding that train, about finding my seat among the ghostly commuters, and finally reaching whatever destination awaits at the end of the line. In these dreams, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just tired and ready to rest. The leather briefcase I saw scattered in the tunnel, I've started carrying one just like it. The high-heeled shoe. I bought a pair for my wife, though I can't remember why. The child's backpack. I found one in my closet that doesn't belong to any of my kids. I think I'm collecting the items I'll carry with me when I finally board that train for the last time. But I'm not ready yet. I'm still fighting the pull, still trying to stay connected to the world above ground. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because if something happens to me, if I disappear one day without explanation, I want someone to know the truth about what lies beneath our city. The abandoned subway tunnels weren't abandoned at all. They were converted into something else entirely, a transportation system for souls who can't find their way to whatever comes next. And once you know about it, once you've seen it with your own eyes, it never really lets you go. So be careful when you're riding the subway late at night. Listen carefully to the sounds coming from the tunnels. And if you ever hear a train approaching from a direction where no tracks should exist, don't investigate. Don't try to find the source of the sound, because some destinations are only meant for the dead, and some journeys are meant to be one way. The conductor was right. I am part of the system now. I can feel the pull getting stronger every day. The desire to return to those tunnels and take my place among the waiting passengers. Sometimes I catch myself checking train schedules for destinations that don't exist, looking for departure times to places with names like Shadowmere Junction and the Terminus of Sorrows. I know it's only a matter of time before I go back down there, before I board that train and take my seat among the ghostly commuters. When that day comes, I'll carry with me the leather briefcase, the high-heeled shoes, the child's backpack, all the items I've been unconsciously collecting, preparing for a journey I never planned to take. But until then, I'm sharing this story with you, because someone needs to know the truth about what lies beneath our feet, about the supernatural infrastructure that connects the world of the living to whatever comes after. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one, because I have a feeling that what I experienced in those tunnels is just the beginning. There are other abandoned places in Chicago, other sealed-off areas where the boundary between life and death has been worn thin by decades of human passage and tragedy. And if you ever find yourself working late in one of Chicago's older buildings, if you hear the sound of a train approaching from somewhere deep underground, remember my story. Remember that some mysteries are meant to stay buried, and some doors are meant to stay closed. Comment below if you've ever experienced something that challenged your understanding of reality, because I know now that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than any of us realize. The dead don't always rest peacefully, and sometimes they build their own infrastructure for the journeys they still need to take. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath Chicago are just one example of this supernatural network. There are others in cities across America and around the world, places where the dead gather, where they wait, where they continue the routines of life even after life has ended. And sometimes the living stumble into these places by accident. Sometimes they become part of the system themselves, whether they want to or not. That's what happened to me, and I'm sharing this story as a warning. Because once you've seen the other side of reality, once you've glimpsed the infrastructure of the afterlife, you can never truly return to the world you knew before. The train is coming for me. I can hear it in the distance, that familiar rumble and clatter that means my time in the world above is running out. When it arrives, I'll have to decide whether to board it willingly or wait for it to claim me on its own terms. But before I go, I want you to know that this story is true. Every word of it. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath Chicago are real, the ghostly passengers are real, and the supernatural transit system that connects the world of the living to the realm of the dead is real. If you don't believe me, I understand. Most people wouldn't believe a story like this, but if you're ever in Chicago, if you ever find yourself in the maintenance areas beneath Lower Wacker Drive, look for the sealed door with the faded warning signs. Listen for the sound of trains running on tracks that don't exist, and if you hear them, if you're tempted to investigate, remember my story. Remember that some journeys are meant to be one way, and some passengers never reach their intended destination. The dead are still commuting beneath our feet, waiting for trains that will carry them to places we can't imagine. And sometimes they're looking for company for the journey. Don't give them the opportunity to find you. Thank you for listening to my story. Share it with someone who needs to know the truth about what lies beneath our cities. And remember, the next time you're riding the subway late at night, you're not alone in those tunnels. The dead are down there too, following their own routes, keeping their own schedules, waiting for their own trains. And sometimes they're waiting for you.